Imagine standing in Lower Manhattan in 1907, the air thick with smoke from coal engines and the scent of fear rising like fog between the towers of finance. Men in black coats running through the streets, shouting numbers, faces pale, papers flying like dying birds. And in the middle of that storm stands one man, unmoved, unshaken, his eyes calm behind round steel-rimmed glasses. J. Pierpont Morgan, the man who would one day hold an empire worth more than $8 trillion in today's money, yet whose name most people today barely remember. This is not the banker from your credit card, not the polite corporation logo, but the original titan, a man who ruled the economy with silence and certainty, who could stop a national panic with a look, and whose power stretched from Wall Street to Washington, from London to every railroad crossing America. They called him the boss of Wall Street, but the men who truly knew him whispered another name, the sovereign without a throne. His presence was heavy, his handshake final, his word law. And yet beneath that iron mask was a man forged in rejection and loneliness, a boy who grew up never being enough for his father. Junius Morgan, a banker of the old world, cold and exact, who treated affection as weakness and viewed his son as a failure in progress. The young Pierpont was sent away to Swiss boarding schools, to grey stone walls and icy lakes, where he learned early that emotion had no place in survival, where he buried his softness and built instead a discipline so sharp it could cut through steel. In London, he watched men in top hats make empires rise and fall before lunchtime, and he promised himself one thing, that one day he would be the man they couldn't ignore. By the time he returned to America, he was already a storm in human form, a mind engineered for conquest. Every failure became a lesson, every insult became fuel. And when the Great Panic of 1907 arrived, when the market screamed and banks fell like dominoes, he did not run. He summoned. In his private library, under dim light and walls lined with leather-bound ledgers, he locked the nation's most powerful bankers inside and refused to let them leave until he decided who would survive and who would be sacrificed. No votes, no democracy, only will, his will. One man, one room, one nation at his command. But what the world saw as arrogance was, deep down, a lifetime of proving something to a ghost. The ghost of a father who never said, "I'm proud of you." And maybe that's why he kept building, buying, saving, and conquering. Because control was the only thing that numbed the ache of being unwanted. So now tell me, if you were born into wealth but raised on rejection, if the world gave you everything but love, would you use power to save a nation, or to finally silence the voice that told you you'd never be enough? He was born in 1837 in Hartford, Connecticut, a quiet child with an illness that kept him inside while other boys ran through the fields, chasing life. Young Pierpont suffered from seizures and skin infections that scarred his face, and in a world that worshipped perfection, he learned early that he would never be admired for his looks. So he built something else, a presence, an aura, a kind of power that made people forget what he lacked. His father, Junius, ran an international banking firm in London and saw his son not as a child, but as an investment to be trained, shaped, and hardened. So he sent him across the ocean away from comfort to learn the discipline of money. In the cold air of Switzerland, among granite mountains and strict tutors, Pierpont learned the rhythm of precision, the numbers, the risk, the patience, and beneath it all, he hid a fire that burned to prove that he was more than a shadow of his father. When he returned to America, he entered the chaotic world of post-Civil War finance, where fortunes rose and fell in the space of a telegraph, where greed was a language and fear was the only truth. He started quietly, working in the offices of Duncan, Sherman and Coty, a New York affiliate of his father's London firm, learning the ropes, the tricks, the manipulation of trust. But what he really studied was people, their weaknesses, their hunger, their panic. He saw that markets weren't driven by numbers, but by emotion, and emotion could could be controlled. When others chased gold, he chased control. When others shouted, he stayed silent, and silence became his weapon. By the 1860s, he began financing railroads, not because he loved trains, but because he understood what few others did. Whoever controlled the rails controlled the nation's heartbeat. With every merger, every rescue, every ruthless acquisition, he was weaving the fabric of power tighter around himself, becoming the invisible spine of American industry. Men twice his age knelt before him for loans, and yet, even then, he wasn't satisfied. The deeper he went into success, the further he drifted from peace. His life became a calculation using efficiency, precision, dominance, but not joy. He collected art, yachts, and influence. But when he looked into a mirror, all he saw was his father's disappointment staring back. Still, the empire grew, and behind every deal there was always the same motive: control, order, the refusal to ever feel powerless again. And that obsession would soon lead him into battles that shaped the modern American economy, where victory meant saving capitalism itself, and failure meant chaos across the world. But before he could save anything, he'd have to watch it nearly collapse, and with it, everything he'd built. By the late 1890s, the American economy had become a restless beast. Railroads were overbuilt, banks overextended, and speculators gambled fortunes they didn't have. Behind the glittering facade of progress, everything was cracking. And in the center of that chaos stood Pierpont Morgan. Older now, heavier, his eyes still sharp, but carrying the weariness of a man who had seen too many men fall to greed. He had built his fortune by reorganizing failing railroads, forcing order where others saw chaos, carving discipline into industries run by ego and risk. He didn't ask for permission, he demanded obedience. When companies begged for rescue, he gave them cash in exchange for control, slicing away waste, merging rivals, and creating a new kind of power, the corporate syndicate. He was not merely a banker, he was the architect of the modern system. The New York Times called him a financial autocrat, but the truth was more complex. Morgan wasn't driven by money anymore. He was driven by the need to create order in a country addicted to chaos. He began building what would become the foundation of modern American capitalism, the syndicate model, private groups of financiers who pooled their wealth and influence to stabilize, manipulate, or rescue entire sectors. The early Wall Street syndicate was born in his private office, where the air smelled of cigar smoke and mahogany, and every whispered conversation could shift millions of dollars. His circle was small but lethal: James Stillman of National City Bank, George F. Baker of First National, and a few others who shared his appetite for control. Together, they didn't just invest in companies. They created them, shaped them, merged them, until every major industry bent around their decisions. They funded the steel consolidation that birthed U.S. Steel, the first billion-dollar corporation in history. They financed General Electric, stitched together from Edison's dreams and Morgan's money. Yet with each victory, Morgan felt a tightening in his chest, a growing isolation. He had power beyond imagination, yet the world he ruled was fragile, built on confidence. And confidence, he knew, was a currency that could vanish overnight. When rumors began swirling in 1907 that the banks were unstable, that trust companies were failing, and that a run on Wall Street was beginning, even Morgan's name wasn't enough to stop the panic. He watched men he'd once mentored fall apart, fortunes wiped in hours, the entire nation teetering on collapse. But that night, as telegraphs rang and traders screamed, Morgan did something that stunned the world. He locked the doors of his private library at Madison Avenue and called in the nation's most powerful bankers. Inside that candlelit room, he took control. Not through law, not through government, but through sheer force of will. The United States government was powerless, the Treasury helpless, yet this one man, with his pocket watch ticking and cigar smoke swirling, would decide who lived and who died in the financial world. The Syndicate was no longer a group of investors. It was an empire, and as he sat in that room, orchestrating the salvation of Wall Street with nothing but reputation and nerve, Morgan knew one thing. He had finally become what his father wanted him to be, the master of order. But what he didn't realize was that the price of that control was already eating away at him, and soon even the king of finance would face a reckoning no money could prevent. The doors of the library stayed shut for 3 days. Inside, under the dim glow of gas lamps and the tick of an old clock, Pierpont Morgan orchestrated one of the most intense moments in American financial history. Outside, crowds gathered in the streets, praying, cursing, waiting for word. The panic of 1907 was no longer just a crisis. It was a collapse. Banks were folding by the hour. The New York Stock Exchange teetered on the edge of closing its doors. The President of the United States couldn't stop it. The Treasury had no plan. Only one man in America still had enough credibility to summon the nation's financiers and make them listen. And that man was Morgan. He walked slowly around the room, his cigar trailing a thin thread of smoke, his voice low but sharp. Around him sat the titans of Wall Street, men worth millions, trembling like schoolboys. Some begged for mercy. Others argued for their survival. Morgan listened, then silenced them with a single word. "Gentlemen." He told them the market would not save itself. Either they stood together, or they all went down together.
And he wasn't asking.
He was commanding. One by one, he demanded they open their books, reveal their assets, show their weaknesses. No one had ever done that before, not even to the government. But under his stare, they did. He paced, calculated, and with a single pen stroke, decided the fate of entire companies. He merged failing banks into stronger ones, poured private money into collapsing trusts, and used his syndicate, his secret network of allies, to prop up the entire system. When one bank refused to join, he threatened to ruin them by morning. They complied. It wasn't democracy. It was dictatorship, cloaked in a banker's suit. At dawn on the third day, the panic began to ease. Word spread that Morgan had restored confidence, that money was flowing again. Men who had cursed his name now called him a hero. Reporters hailed him as the man who saved America. But behind those headlines, something darker stirred. Morgan knew he hadn't saved America. He had exposed its weakness. The entire financial system depended not on government, not on law, but on the will of one aging man in a smoke-filled library. And deep down, he knew that wasn't power. That was fragility. When he stepped outside into the cold morning air, crowds cheered, calling his name. He didn't smile. He simply looked at them, their hope, their desperation, and knew the truth. America was addicted to men like him. And someday, when he was gone, the country would need a system to replace him. But as he climbed into his carriage, his hands trembling slightly from exhaustion, one thought kept echoing in his mind. I didn't save them.
I just delayed the fall. And that thought, haunting.
Relentless, would follow him to his final days, as the empire he built turned into something even bigger. Something no man could control, the birth of the Federal Reserve, and the end of the Age of Kings. The year was 1913, and the Titan was fading. J. Pierpont Morgan was 75 now, his hair silver, his health failing, his empire larger than any monarch's, but his body paying the price of decades of domination. He moved slower, spoke softer, but when he entered a room, conversation still stopped. He had spent his life holding the American economy together with his own hands. Railroads, steel, electricity, banking, and for the first time, he was realizing what he had created was too big even for him. The world was changing. Machines were replacing men. Governments were learning to intervene. His syndicate, once a private brotherhood of financiers, was now seen by the public as a shadow government accused of greed, corruption, and manipulation. Newspapers printed his caricature with a nose like a thundercloud and eyes like coins. Protesters shouted outside his offices, calling him the Money King, the Emperor of Wall Street. Yet the truth was more tragic. He had never loved money for its own sake. He loved order. He loved control. And now both were slipping away. That same year, Congress debated a new idea, a centralized bank that could prevent future panics, a system that would replace the role he once played in 1907, the Federal Reserve. It was, in every way, a monument built on his legacy, a government version of the power he had exercised alone. He had become the model for the very system that would erase him. Reporters asked him if he feared the future. He smiled faintly and said, "The first step towards getting somewhere is to decide that you are not going to stay where you are." But privately, he was restless. His heart was failing. He spent his final months aboard his yacht, the Corsair, drifting between Europe and America, reading, smoking, writing letters to his family. The same man who once commanded the fate of nations now spent his mornings staring at the horizon, the sea stretching endless and silent. In March 1913, while traveling through Rome, he collapsed. The most powerful banker in the world, the man who had saved a nation, died quietly in a hotel room. No board meetings, no fanfare, just the sound of rain on the window. When word reached New York, the stock exchange paused for 2 minutes. Railroads across America stopped their trains in tribute. Men removed their hats. And yet, within a week, the markets moved on, the papers filled with new names, new deals, new kings. His empire, the $8 trillion web of companies, banks and industries, continued without him, now faceless, now eternal. But what haunted those who studied him wasn't his wealth. It was the emptiness behind it. All his life, Pierpont Morgan sought control, and in the end, he built a system that proved no one could truly hold it. He tamed chaos but lost peace. He mastered money but never conquered loneliness. His legacy became the skeleton of modern finance. Stable, cold, efficient,
and heartless. And now the question turns to you. If life handed you limitless power but demanded your soul in return, would you take it?
Would you rule the storm, or walk away before it swallowed you whole? A decade after Morgan's death, his name had become legend, spoken in the marble halls of Wall Street like a myth, a ghost who once ruled from the shadows. The empire he built had multiplied, spreading like a living organism. His bank, J.P. Morgan & Co., evolved into a financial dynasty controlling railroads, steel, electricity, shipping, and eventually the pulse of global finance itself. By the 1930s, even as the Great Depression crushed millions, the institutions he founded stood like stone pillars in a flood. The Morgan men, his protégés, his successors, sat in boardrooms across New York, their pens shaping the fates of nations, their voices calm while presidents panicked. They weren't kings, but they had inherited his crown. The world didn't realize it, but every time a company borrowed money, every time a railroad moved goods, every time a government issued bonds,
Morgan's invisible hand was still there.
His empire had become what no man ever could, eternal. His influence reached into Europe, Asia, and beyond. Decades later, the bank would merge, evolve, expand, becoming what we know today as J.P. Morgan Chase, the modern descendant of that early Wall Street syndicate.
Its value?
Over $8 trillion in managed assets, a number so vast it could buy entire nations. The empire he once ruled from a library now spanned continents, satellites, algorithms, and data streams. The face was gone, but the system lived on, and yet, if you peel back the layers, the same heartbeat remains. The desire for control, the fear of chaos, the faith that order can be built from greed. The same philosophy Pierpont Morgan breathed into the bones of Wall Street. When the world panics, power belongs to those who stay calm. That creed shaped not just banks, but modern capitalism itself. It birthed the myth of the self-made titan, the savior of markets, the illusion that one man can master the storm. But behind every empire there's always a cost, the human heart that built it, the families left behind, the quiet moments of doubt that no amount of gold could drown. In today's world of digital finance and endless screens, Morgan's ghost still lingers. Every market crash, every rescue, every trillion-dollar decision echoes that night in 1907 when one man locked the doors and took control. History remembers him as ruthless, brilliant, unstoppable, but maybe he was just a man who couldn't stand the thought of losing again. Maybe all that wealth was just armor against the memory of a father's cold eyes, and so the $8 trillion empire he founded remains both triumph and warning, a monument to human will, and a reminder of how fragile power truly is. So let me ask you, if you had the chance to build something that would outlive you, something vast enough to shape the world, but it meant never finding peace, would you still do it?
Power never really dies.
It just changes hands, changes form, slips through time like smoke between generations. After Morgan's death, his name became myth, but the machine he built never stopped moving. It consumed new men, new ambitions, new wars. His protégés financed the rebuilding of Europe after World War I, orchestrated mergers that redefined capitalism, and advised presidents who once feared his father's shadow. The Morgan banks quietly evolved, splitting, merging, and adapting to each new age of finance like a living organism. Chase National, Guarantee Trust, Morgan Stanley, JP Morgan Chase. The same veins, the same DNA. Morgan's idea of control had become America's default operating system. The Syndicate model, the notion that private capital could steer nations, had become reality. By the 21st century, that system had grown beyond anything Pierpont could have imagined. The empire he forged with cigars, ledgers, and telegrams now lived inside data servers and trading algorithms. It moved trillions at the speed of light, influencing interest rates, currencies, even elections. The men in dark suits who once gathered in his library now sat behind screens, their decisions echoing across the world in seconds. The panic of 1907 had given birth to the Federal Reserve. The crashes of 1929, 2008 and beyond became its children. Every era had its crisis. Every crisis had its savior. And always, somewhere in the background, the same quiet structure remained: private capital, central power,
and the illusion of control. But if you strip away the numbers,
the skyscrapers, the corporate facades, it always comes back to the same human story: fear and control. Morgan's entire life was a war against chaos. The sickness that scarred him as a boy, the rejection that hardened him as a son, the endless need to bring order to a world that refused to obey. It all led here. He believed that if he could control money, he could control uncertainty. But the truth is, he only delayed it. Every empire that tries to master risk eventually becomes a prisoner of it. His empire, now worth $8 trillion, remains both the symbol and the symptom of that endless fight. And that's where this story leaves us. Not with a victory, not with a tragedy, but with a question that still haunts Wall Street a century later. Is control the highest form of success, or just the most seductive illusion? If you were in his place, standing in that library as the world collapsed outside, would you lock the doors and take command, or would you walk away and let chaos do its work? Tell me in the comments. If life gave you the power to hold the world together, would you trust yourself enough to take it?